My blind husband doesn't know I've been lying to him for years. 3 years ago, my husband Adrian lost his sight in a workplace accident at the construction site where he'd worked as a foreman for 12 years. A steel beam fell during a structural collapse, and while he survived with relatively minor physical injuries, the impact caused severe damage to his optic nerves that no surgery could repair. The doctors said he'd never see again, and I watched the man I'd loved since college crumble under the weight of that diagnosis. We'd been married for 8 years when it happened, living in the house we'd bought together in what used to be a nice neighborhood on the outskirts of Portland. Adrian had always been the provider, the strong one, the person who fixed problems and took care of everything. Losing his sight didn't just take away his ability to see, it stripped away his sense of purpose and left him completely dependent on me in ways that terrified him. Those first few months were the hardest thing we'd ever been through together. Harder than the miscarriage we'd had 5 years earlier, harder than the financial struggles when his company almost went bankrupt. I watched Adrian sink into a depression so deep I wasn't sure he'd ever find his way out, and I made a decision during those dark months that would define the next 3 years of our marriage. I decided to lie to him about everything, to create a version of reality that would give him reasons to keep living, instead of drowning in the darkness of what his life had actually become. It started small, with little lies about how people reacted to him when we went out in public. Adrian was intensely self-conscious about his white cane and the way his eyes no longer focused properly, drifting slightly to the left when he tried to look at someone speaking. The first time I lied was at the grocery store about 2 months after the accident, when a woman stared at him with this mixture of pity and discomfort that made my stomach turn. Adrian sensed something was wrong and asked if people were staring, and I told him no, that everyone was just going about their shopping and nobody was paying attention to us. The relief on his face was immediate and visible, his shoulders relaxing as we continued down the aisle. That moment taught me something important about the power of words to shape reality for someone who couldn't verify what I was saying. If I told Adrian the world was kind and normal and unchanged by his disability, he had no choice but to believe me because he couldn't see the truth for himself. From that day forward, I became the curator of his reality, carefully filtering every piece of information that came to him through me. When people stared or whispered or pulled their children away from us in public, I described friendly smiles and casual indifference. When businesses were inaccessible or employees were impatient with his slower pace, I told him everyone had been accommodating and kind. I built him a world that was softer and more accepting than the one we actually lived in, and I watched him slowly start to heal within that constructed reality. The lies expanded as the months passed, and I realized how much of Adrian's world depended on my descriptions. Our house had been beautiful when we bought it 7 years earlier. A renovated Craftsman with original hardwood floors and a garden that I'd spent years cultivating. But maintaining a house requires money and time, both of which had become scarce after Adrian's accident. His disability payments were less than half of what he'd earned working, and I'd had to cut back my hours at the dental office where I worked as a hygienist to be home more often to help him adjust. The garden died first, the carefully tended roses and vegetable beds turning brown and overgrown as I focused all my energy on Adrian's needs. The house followed gradually, with small repairs going undone, and maintenance being deferred because we couldn't afford to fix everything that needed attention. Paint peeled from the exterior walls, the roof developed a leak that I patched temporarily with tarps, and the hardwood floors we'd loved became scratched and dull from years of neglect. But when Adrian asked me to describe what the house looked like now, I told him it was exactly as he remembered it, beautiful and well-maintained, the garden thriving with seasonal flowers. I'd take him outside on warm days and position him in the one corner of the yard that still looked decent, describing imaginary rose bushes and vegetable plants while he sat in the sun believing our home was unchanged. The neighborhood deteriorated faster than the house, transforming from a quiet family area into something harder and more dangerous. The economic downturn had hit our part of the city particularly hard, and many of our former neighbors had moved away or lost their homes to foreclosure. The empty houses attracted squatters and drug activity, and I started hearing gunshots at night with alarming regularity. Our street, which had once been lined with families and children playing, became a place where I hurried from the car to the house with my keys held between my fingers like a weapon. Break-ins happened frequently, and our house was burglarized twice in the first year after Adrian's accident. The thieves took our television, Adrian's tools from the garage, and various electronics we'd accumulated over the years. I filed police reports and dealt with the insurance claims, but I never told Adrian what had happened. Instead, I moved things around and made excuses about why certain items were in storage or being repaired, creating elaborate stories about upgrades and renovations to explain why things he remembered were no longer where he expected them to be. When he asked to listen to music on the stereo system he'd been so proud of, I played music from my phone and told him I'd connected it to the speakers, when in reality those speakers had been stolen months ago. Every lie required additional lies to support it, creating this complex web of fiction that I had to keep track of constantly to avoid contradictions. The lies about other people were perhaps the most extensive and emotionally draining part of maintaining Adrian's alternate reality. His family had never fully accepted me when we first married. His mother in particular had made it clear she thought Adrian was settling by marrying a dental hygienist instead of someone with a more prestigious career. After the accident, they visited twice in the first month and then gradually stopped coming around, their discomfort with Adrian's disability apparently outweighing their familial obligation. His brother called occasionally but never visited, and his mother sent cards on holidays with brief impersonal messages that made it clear she'd moved on with her life. The rejection devastated me, but I never let Adrian know how thoroughly his family had abandoned him. Instead, I invented an elaborate fiction about their continued involvement in our lives. I'd tell him his mother had called while he was sleeping and that she'd asked about his therapy and sent her love. I'd describe visits from his brother that never happened, inventing conversations and shared meals that existed only in my descriptions. On holidays, I'd read him the cards that actually arrived but embellished the messages, adding warmth and personal details that his family had never bothered to include. I did this because I knew the truth would break him. that learning his family had essentially written him off after the accident would confirm his worst fears about being a burden nobody wanted to deal with. So I gave him a fictional family who loved and supported him, and I watched him draw strength from relationships that existed only in my words. My own family was different, but complicated in ways that also required careful management of information. My sister Leslie had always been jealous of my marriage to Adrian, constantly comparing her string of failed relationships to our seemingly perfect partnership. After Adrian's accident, she'd been supportive initially, but gradually became resentful of the attention and care I had to give him. She'd make comments about how I was wasting my life taking care of someone who'd never be independent again, suggesting I should consider divorce and start over while I was still young enough to find someone else. Her cruelty stunned me, but I couldn't completely cut her off because she was my only sibling and our parents had died when I was in my 20s. Instead, I severely limited Adrian's exposure to her, screening her calls and visits to prevent her toxic opinions from reaching him. When she did come over, I'd brief her beforehand about what she could and couldn't say, threatening to cut her off entirely if she said anything that would hurt Adrian or reveal the truth about our situation. She'd comply reluctantly, putting on a performance of sisterly concern that was convincing enough for someone who couldn't see her facial expressions or body language. After she left, Adrian would comment on how nice it was that Leslie visited so often and how supportive she'd been, completely unaware that these visits were carefully orchestrated and edited versions of reality. I hated that I had to manage his relationship with my own sister like this, but the alternative was letting him hear her suggest he was ruining my life, which would have destroyed what little self-worth he'd managed to rebuild. The financial lies were perhaps the most dangerous because they had concrete consequences I couldn't talk or describe away. Adrian's disability payments covered about 40% of what he used to earn, and my reduced hours at the dental office meant our household income had dropped by more than half. We'd burned through our savings in the first year covering medical expenses and making up the income shortfall, and by the second year, we were accumulating debt at an alarming rate. Credit cards maxed out, the mortgage fell behind, and I started getting collection calls that I'd take outside so Adrian wouldn't overhear. I told him we were fine financially, that his disability payments and my salary were covering everything, and that I'd actually gotten a raise at work that made our situation more comfortable than before. The truth was, I'd been working extra shifts and taking on additional responsibilities at the office, coming home exhausted and stressed but maintaining the fiction that everything was easy and manageable. I'd opened a separate bank account that Adrian didn't know about, funneling money between accounts and juggling payments to keep us from losing the house or having utilities shut off. Every month was a calculation of what could be delayed and what absolutely had to be paid, and I lived in constant fear that something would happen that would expose how precarious our financial situation actually was. But I kept lying because I knew Adrian's sense of masculinity and self-worth was already devastated by his inability to work, and learning that we were drowning financially because of his accident would have pushed him into a depression I wasn't sure he'd survive. The lies about the outside world and current events required me to become a filter for all information that reached Adrian. He'd always been someone who followed the news closely, and in the first months after losing his sight, he'd asked me to read him articles and tell him what was happening in the world. But the news during those years was relentlessly dark, filled with violence and political chaos, and stories that emphasized how dangerous and uncertain everything had become. I started editing what I shared with him, omitting the worst stories and softening the details of the ones I did read. When there was a mass shooting at a school 30 miles from us, I told him there had been an incident, but everyone was safe and the situation was resolved. When our neighborhood experienced a series of violent crimes, including a murder 2 streets over, I told him there had been some minor property crime, but nothing serious. I curated his understanding of the world to be more stable and hopeful than reality, giving him news stories about scientific breakthroughs and community achievements, while hiding the darkness that seemed to be spreading everywhere. This meant I had to be constantly vigilant about what played on the radio, or what other people might mention in conversation, redirecting topics and changing subjects whenever something came up that contradicted the version of reality I'd constructed for him. It was exhausting and isolating because I couldn't share my own fears and frustrations about the world with the person I'd always talked to about everything. Adrian's therapy and rehabilitation were areas where I had to balance truth with encouragement in ways that felt particularly manipulative. His occupational therapist was teaching him skills to navigate the world independently, using his cane and developing techniques for daily tasks that didn't require sight. He'd make progress slowly, learning to cook simple meals and move through the house without assistance. And he'd ask me constantly if he was doing well, if he was improving fast enough, if I was proud of how hard he was working. The truth was his progress was average at best, that many people adapted to blindness faster and more completely than he was managing. His depression and fear held him back, making him hesitant and overly cautious in ways that frustrated his therapist. But I told him he was doing amazingly well, that his therapist had said he was one of the best students she'd ever worked with, that his progress was remarkable given how recently he'd lost his sight. I invented compliments and milestones to keep him motivated, celebrating small achievements as if they were major breakthroughs. When he knocked over a pot while trying to cook or got disoriented in a part of the house he should have known, I'd reassure him that these setbacks were completely normal, and that everyone struggled with the same challenges. I turned his rehabilitation into a narrative of constant improvement and success, even when the reality was much more complicated and frustrating for both of us. The social isolation that came with Adrian's blindness was something I tried desperately to hide from him, while simultaneously being trapped in it myself. His friends from work had stopped calling after the first few months, their initial expressions of support fading into silence as they moved on with their lives and forgot about the colleague who'd been injured. The couples we'd socialized with before the accident gradually stopped inviting us to gatherings, their discomfort with Adrian's disability making them avoid situations where they'd have to interact with him. I'd make excuses for why we couldn't attend events that we were never actually invited to, telling Adrian that schedules just hadn't worked out, or that I'd declined because he'd been tired. I'd describe phone calls from friends that never happened, inventing conversations and plans that gave him the impression our social life was intact, when in reality, we'd been almost completely abandoned by everyone we'd known before the accident. The isolation was crushing for me because I had no outlet to discuss how hard this was, no friends to confide in about the weight of maintaining these lies, no support system beyond the therapist I'd started seeing secretly to help me cope with the stress. I'd leave my therapy appointments and immediately put my supportive, optimistic mask back on before returning home to continue the performance of everything being fine. The physical intimacy in our marriage changed dramatically after the accident, in ways that required their own set of lies and adjustments. Adrian's depression and medication affected his ability and interest, and the loss of sight changed the dynamics of physical connection in ways neither of us knew how to navigate. He'd apologize constantly for not being able to satisfy me, for his body not responding the way it used to, for being broken in yet another way. I'd reassure him that everything was fine, that I didn't mind, that our connection was about more than physical intimacy. The truth was, I missed the relationship we'd had before, missed feeling desired and connected to him in that way, but admitting that would have added another layer of inadequacy to the burden he was already carrying. Instead, I took care of my own needs privately, and pretended that I was completely fulfilled by the limited physical connection we still maintained. I described my own body to him in ways that were more flattering than accurate, having gained weight from stress and lack of time for self-care, but telling him I looked exactly as I had before the accident. When we were intimate, I'd guide his hands to the parts of my body I was least self-conscious about, and redirect him away from the areas where weight had accumulated or skin had changed. I performed attraction and satisfaction, making sounds and giving feedback that encouraged him while hiding my own complicated feelings about how much our physical relationship had deteriorated. The lies about my own well-being were perhaps the most necessary and the most damaging to my mental health. Adrian would ask constantly if I was okay, if taking care of him was too much, if I was happy. Every time I'd tell him I was fine, that I was glad to be there for him, that our life together was exactly what I wanted. The truth was, I was drowning in exhaustion and stress, working extra hours while managing all the household responsibilities that had previously been shared, navigating the financial crisis in secret, and maintaining the elaborate fiction that everything was perfect. I stopped sleeping well, lying awake at night running through all the lies I'd told and making sure I hadn't contradicted myself or left openings where the truth might leak through. I developed stress-related health problems, tension headaches that wouldn't go away, and digestive issues that I attributed to a stomach bug, instead of acknowledging they were symptoms of the unsustainable life I was living. My appearance changed as self-care fell to the bottom of my priority list, but Adrian couldn't see that I'd stopped wearing makeup or that my clothes were increasingly worn and outdated. I'd describe myself as looking great, tell him I'd gotten my hair done when I'd just washed it at home, mention buying new clothes that I'd actually found at thrift stores. I performed wellness and happiness while slowly falling apart inside, knowing that if Adrian ever suspected how much I was struggling, his guilt would be unbearable for both of us. The turning point came on a Saturday afternoon in late fall, about 3 years after the accident. Adrian had been working with his therapist on independent navigation and wanted to try walking to the corner store by himself, a distance of about 3 blocks. I was terrified but tried not to show it, knowing he needed to build confidence in his ability to navigate the world without me. I helped him plan the route, describing the path and landmarks in the idealized version of our neighborhood that existed in my stories, making it sound safe and straightforward. What I didn't tell him was that the corner store had closed 6 months ago and the building was now abandoned, its windows broken and covered with graffiti. I didn't mention that the route would take him past several houses that were clearly occupied by squatters, or that there had been an assault on that same street just 2 weeks earlier. I watched him leave with his cane, moving carefully down the sidewalk, and I immediately grabbed my jacket to follow at a distance. I kept about half a block behind him, close enough to intervene if something went wrong but far enough that he wouldn't hear my footsteps. Watching him navigate alone was agonizing, every hesitation and moment of confusion sending waves of anxiety through me. When he reached the corner where the store used to be, he stopped, confusion evident in his posture as he tried to reconcile the sounds and space around him with the description I'd given him of a functioning business. I watched a group of men emerge from the abandoned building, clearly high or drunk based on their movements and loud voices. They spotted Adrian immediately, and I saw them exchange looks and start moving toward him. My heart stopped as I realized they saw an easy target, someone vulnerable and alone who wouldn't even see them coming. I started running, pulling out my phone to call 911 while simultaneously shouting at Adrian to get down. The men scattered when they saw me approaching, probably not expecting anyone to be watching, and I reached Adrian just as he was trying to process what was happening. He was shaking, asking what had happened, why I was there, what he'd almost walked into. For the first time in 3 years, I broke down completely, sitting on the sidewalk next to him and sobbing while he held me and tried to understand what had just occurred. We sat there for maybe 10 minutes, both of us crying, before I helped him up, and we walked home together in silence. Back at the house, Adrian made me sit down and explain what had really happened, what the neighborhood was actually like, why I'd been following him when I'd said I was staying home. I started talking and couldn't stop, the truth pouring out in a flood that felt both terrifying and liberating. I told him about the abandoned store, about the men who'd approached him, about following him because I'd known the route wasn't safe despite what I'd said. Then he asked the question that changed everything. He asked how long I'd been lying to him about the neighborhood, and I realized I couldn't tell him just part of the truth anymore. Either I continued the lies or I told him everything. And after 3 years of carrying this alone, I didn't have the strength to keep lying. So I told him everything. I started with small lies and worked up to bigger ones, explaining how I'd been filtering reality for him since the first weeks after the accident. I described what our house actually looked like now, the peeling paint and broken fixtures and dying garden. I told him about the financial crisis we were in, the debt and the collection calls and how close we'd come to losing the house multiple times. I admitted that his family barely contacted him anymore, and that most of what I'd told him about their calls and visits was fiction. I confessed to editing the news and hiding the violence in our neighborhood and creating an entire false version of the world that was kinder and safer than reality. I told him about my own struggles, the weight gain and health problems, and the crushing exhaustion of maintaining these lies while trying to keep us afloat financially. Every confession felt like peeling back layers of skin, exposing wounds I'd been hiding for years. Adrian sat completely still through all of it, his face unreadable. And when I finally stopped talking, the silence stretched so long I thought he might never speak to me again. When he finally did speak, his voice was quiet and controlled in a way that scared me more than anger would have. He asked why I thought he couldn't handle the truth, why I'd decided he was too fragile to live in the real world, why I'd taken away his ability to make informed decisions about his own life. I tried to explain that I'd been trying to protect him, to give him reasons to keep going when everything seemed hopeless, but he cut me off and said I'd been protecting myself from having to deal with his real reactions to real problems. He said I'd turned him into a child who needed to be sheltered and lied to, taking away what little dignity and agency he had left after losing his sight. He was right, and hearing him articulate what I'd done made me realize how profoundly I'd betrayed him despite believing my intentions were good. We spent the next several hours talking, with Adrian asking detailed questions about every aspect of our life that I'd misrepresented. He wanted to know exactly how bad our finances were, what the house really looked like, which of his friends and family had abandoned him. Each answer felt like a knife, watching him process the gap between what he'd believed and what was actually true. The hardest part was seeing his trust in me shatter in real time, realizing that every description I'd given him for the past 3 years was now suspect, that he couldn't believe anything I said about the world because I'd proven myself to be a dedicated and elaborate liar. Adrian asked me to take him on a walk through the neighborhood the next day, describing everything exactly as it was without filtering or softening the reality. We walked for over an hour while I pointed out the abandoned houses, the graffiti, the evidence of drug activity and decay that I'd been hiding from him. I described the actual state of our garden and house, admitting that I'd positioned him strategically to avoid the worst areas. We went to the corner store location and I told him about its closure and what the building looked like now. When we got home, he asked me to walk him through every room of the house, describing the peeling wallpaper and scratched floors and all the repairs that needed to be done that I'd been claiming were already completed. He ran his hands over surfaces I'd told him were pristine, feeling the damage and neglect that words couldn't fully convey. That evening, he called his brother and had a frank conversation about how often they'd actually been in contact, learning that what I'd described as regular calls and visits had really been occasional brief check-ins that his brother clearly felt guilty about. The disappointment in Adrian's voice as he processed his family's actual level of involvement was devastating to witness, made worse by knowing I'd prevented him from dealing with that disappointment when it first happened. The weeks that followed were the hardest period of our marriage, worse even than the immediate aftermath of the accident. Adrian was processing 3 years of false reality all at once, grieving not just his lost sight but the lost time and the lost trust in the person he'd depended on completely. He moved into the guest bedroom, saying he needed space to think and that he couldn't sleep next to someone he didn't trust anymore. I understood, but it broke my heart, the physical distance representing the emotional gulf that my lies had created. We started seeing a therapist who specialized in disability and relationships, trying to salvage what was left of our marriage. The therapist helped Adrian articulate how infantilizing my behavior had been, how I'd essentially decided he couldn't handle reality and had taken away his agency in ways that went beyond anything his disability had done. She helped me understand that my lies, despite being motivated by love and protection, had been fundamentally about my own inability to cope with seeing him in pain, that I'd prioritized my comfort over his right to make informed choices about his own life. The work was painful and slow, requiring me to examine my own control issues and tendency to manage other people's emotions instead of letting them experience and process things naturally. It required Adrian to confront how much easier it had been to live in the comfortable fiction I'd created, even as he resented being kept there. Rebuilding trust meant radical honesty about everything, which was terrifying after 3 years of careful lying. I had to tell Adrian when someone stared at him in public, describe negative reactions instead of pretending everything was fine. I had to read him his actual bank statements and let him hear the collection calls, involving him in financial decisions even when I thought his suggestions weren't practical. I had to facilitate actual contact with his family instead of buffering him from their neglect, letting him experience and respond to their distance in real time. Every instinct told me to soften things and protect him from harsh realities, but I'd learned that protection had become a cage. The house repairs we could afford were minimal, but Adrian insisted on knowing exactly what needed to be done and how much it would cost, saying he'd rather live in a house he knew was falling apart than in a false palace. We had to talk about the garden, and he asked me to plant some herbs in the one corner that still got good sun, saying he wanted to participate in creating something real instead of believing in described beauty that didn't exist. He started asking people directly how they were reacting to him instead of relying on my descriptions, learning to interpret tone and word choice to understand when someone was uncomfortable or pitying. Some of those interactions were painful, confirming that not everyone was kind or accepting, but he said knowing the truth was better than living in my curated version of reality. The financial situation required drastic changes that we made together instead of me handling everything in secret. Adrian insisted on attending meetings with the bank about our mortgage, sitting through uncomfortable conversations about debt and options. We sold the house eventually, unable to keep up with payments even after I explained the full situation, and moved into a smaller apartment in a better neighborhood. Adrian said losing the house hurt, but knowing about it and participating in the decision was different from having it managed behind his back. He got more aggressive about his rehabilitation, pushing himself harder because he understood the real stakes instead of the cushioned version I'd presented. His therapist noticed the change, commenting that his progress had accelerated since he'd become more engaged with actual challenges rather than the simplified version he'd been working with before. He was angry with me still, that anger surfacing in unexpected moments when he'd remember something I'd lied about, but he was also more present and engaged than he'd been in 3 years. The depression that had defined his early adjustment started lifting as he took ownership of his life again, making choices based on real information instead of my filtered version of the world. It was harder for both of us in many ways, but it was real in a way our previous life together hadn't been. My sister Leslie didn't take the honesty well when I stopped managing her interactions with Adrian. She'd come over to the new apartment and make a comment about how much easier it must be in a smaller space, and Adrian would tell her directly that actually it was harder but necessary because of our financial situation. She'd look at me to bail her out of the awkward conversation, and I'd stay silent, letting Adrian respond to her the way he wanted to. Eventually, she stopped coming around much, uncomfortable with not being able to say whatever she wanted without consequence. Adrian said he'd rather have limited contact with someone showing their real feelings than regular contact with someone performing support they didn't actually feel. It was a hard lesson about how my lies had prevented not just him, but everyone around us from having authentic relationships based on honest communication. His actual friends, the few who remained, appreciated being able to interact with him directly instead of through my filter. They'd ask him questions instead of asking me to speak for him, and I watched him come alive in those conversations in ways he hadn't when I'd been mediating everything. One friend told me privately that the new version of Adrian, the one dealing with reality directly, reminded him more of the person he'd known before the accident than the carefully managed version I'd been presenting. Our financial situation improved slowly as we both committed to being honest about what we could afford and what sacrifices needed to be made. I took on extra shifts without pretending it was easy, coming home exhausted and admitting when I was tired instead of performing endless energy. Adrian worked with a career counselor about jobs he could do with his disability, eventually finding work doing phone-based customer service that didn't require sight. The money wasn't much, but it gave him purpose and the ability to contribute financially, something my lies about us being fine had prevented him from feeling urgency about. We paid down debt gradually, making progress that was slower than I would have liked, but faster than I'd managed when I was handling everything in secret while pretending we had no problems. The transparency meant Adrian understood exactly where we stood financially at any given time, something that gave him anxiety, but also agency to make suggestions and participate in planning. He'd asked me to read him articles about financial planning and disability benefits, educating himself instead of relying on me to manage everything and tell him it was fine. I had to learn to sit with his anxiety about money instead of trying to make it go away with false reassurances, trusting that he was strong enough to handle the truth even when it was uncomfortable. The relationship with Adrian's family never really recovered, but at least it was honest now. His mother called occasionally and was stiffly polite, clearly uncomfortable with his disability, but no longer able to hide behind my fictional versions of their interactions. Adrian had conversations with her where he told her directly that her distance hurt, and she'd make excuses about being busy that neither of us pretended to believe. His brother visited twice in the year after the truth came out, awkward visits where everyone struggled to find things to talk about. Adrian told me after the second visit that it was painful, but better than believing in loving family relationships that didn't exist, that he'd rather know where he actually stood with people than live in my comforting fiction. We built a chosen family of sorts from his support group and my coworkers, people who showed up consistently and honestly instead of the biological family who'd mostly disappeared. The therapist said this was healthier anyway, building relationships based on actual connection rather than obligation. But I knew Adrian grieved the family he'd thought he had, even as he accepted the reality of the family he actually had. My own mental health improved paradoxically once I stopped lying, despite the relationship being harder in many ways. The stress of maintaining the elaborate fiction had been crushing, and even though radical honesty brought its own challenges, it was at least a stress I could share with Adrian instead of carrying alone. I stopped having the stress-related health problems, my headaches fading and digestive issues resolving as the constant low-level anxiety of potentially being caught in a lie disappeared. I could talk to Adrian about my own struggles now, admitting when I was overwhelmed or frustrated instead of performing competence and positivity. He'd listen and sometimes offer suggestions, but mostly just acknowledge how hard things were, and that validation meant more than the false reassurance I'd been giving myself for years. The therapist said I'd been living in two different realities, the false one I presented to Adrian, and the true one I experienced alone, and that maintaining that split had been psychologically damaging in ways I was only beginning to understand now that it had ended. She helped me work through guilt about the years of lying, distinguishing between intention and impact, acknowledging that I'd meant well while accepting that I'd caused harm through my dishonesty. 2 years after the truth came out, Adrian and I renewed our vows in a small ceremony with just a few close friends. He said he wanted to make a commitment to the real version of me and our real life together, not the performance I'd been maintaining for years. We wrote new vows that emphasized honesty and authentic partnership, promising to share both difficulties and joys without filtering or managing each other's experiences. His vow included a line about appreciating truth even when it was uncomfortable, about preferring difficult reality to comfortable fiction. Mine included an apology for the years I'd spent lying and a commitment to trust him with the truth going forward, even when every instinct told me to protect him from harsh realities. It wasn't a traditional romantic ceremony, but it felt more meaningful than our original wedding because it was based on who we actually were, rather than who we'd hoped to be. The friend who officiated commented afterward that she'd never seen vows that were so unflinchingly honest about difficulty and imperfection, and Adrian said that was exactly the point, that we were committing to a marriage based on reality, rather than illusion. Looking back now at those 3 years of lying, I understand both why I did it and why it was fundamentally wrong despite my good intentions. I'd been operating from a place of trauma and fear, watching someone I loved suffer and feeling powerless to fix it, so I'd tried to fix his perception of reality instead. But in doing so, I'd taken away his dignity and agency, treating him like someone who needed to be protected from truth rather than a partner who deserved to make informed choices about his own life. The therapist said my behavior had been a form of benevolent control, wrapped in love, but ultimately about my own discomfort with his pain, rather than actual protection of his well-being. Learning that distinction had been crucial to understanding why the lying had felt necessary at the time, but why continuing it would have eventually destroyed our marriage completely. Adrian says now that he's grateful I finally told him the truth, even though finding out had been devastating, because living in my constructed reality was slowly killing something essential in him, even as it protected him from immediate pain. Our life now is harder in many measurable ways than the false version I'd created through my lies. We have less money, a smaller living space, and have to navigate genuine challenges together instead of me handling everything while telling him it was easy. But Adrian is more himself than he was during those 3 years, more engaged and present and alive despite the difficulties. He makes his own choices now, sometimes ones I disagree with but respect as his right to make. When we go out in public and someone stares or makes a rude comment, I tell him what actually happened instead of pretending everyone was kind, and we process it together rather than me trying to shield him from the reality of other people's ignorance and discomfort. He tells me this honesty, while sometimes painful, allows him to develop genuine coping strategies instead of the false confidence he'd had when he believed my descriptions of a universally accepting world. Our relationship is more equal now because I'm not positioned as the gatekeeper of reality, just as a partner who experiences and describes the same world we both navigate, him without sight, and me with the responsibility of translating visual information honestly. The biggest change has been learning to trust each other again after my betrayal of trust through 3 years of systematic lying. Adrian had to decide whether someone who'd lied that extensively could ever be believed again, whether our foundation was salvageable or too damaged to rebuild. He told me during one therapy session that he'd chosen to believe in the possibility of change, to give me the chance to prove that I could be honest even when it was uncomfortable, but that the trust would have to be earned back gradually rather than simply given. That's been a years-long process of me demonstrating through consistent honesty that I've learned from my mistakes, and of him taking risks by believing me even when his instinct was to doubt everything I said. The therapist said this rebuilding was actually creating a stronger foundation than we'd had even before the lies, because we were choosing each other with full knowledge of our flaws and failures, rather than the idealized versions of ourselves we'd presented when we first met. There's something powerful about being loved, and choosing to love someone after seeing them at their worst, after experiencing betrayal and deciding to work through it rather than walking away. I still struggle sometimes with the instinct to soften truth, to protect Adrian from harsh realities by filtering information. But now, when I feel that impulse, I recognize it as my own discomfort with his pain rather than actual protection, and I push through it to tell him the truth even when it's hard. Last month, someone we knew from before the accident crossed the street to avoid having to greet Adrian, clearly uncomfortable with his disability. My immediate instinct was to pretend I hadn't noticed and describe something else, but instead I told him what had happened. He was quiet for a moment, then said it hurt, but he appreciated knowing the truth because it helped him understand who his actual friends were versus who'd just been circumstantial acquaintances. That moment felt like a victory for both of us, me overcoming my protective instinct and him handling painful truth with grace while acknowledging the hurt. The therapist says these small moments of choosing honesty over comfort are rebuilding trust more effectively than any grand gestures could, proving through daily choices that I've genuinely changed my approach to our relationship. 3 years into this second version of our marriage, the one based on truth rather than lies, I can say we're genuinely happy in ways we weren't even before the accident. The happiness is more complex and harder one, built on a foundation of honest struggle rather than illusion of perfection. Adrian's career doing customer service work has progressed, and he's now training new employees and has been promoted twice. Our apartment is modest, but we've made it genuinely comfortable rather than me describing imaginary improvements that don't exist. We have real friends who show up consistently instead of the fictional social life I'd invented for him. Our physical relationship has improved because I stopped performing attraction I didn't feel, and we worked together to find new ways of connecting that worked for both of us honestly. The financial stress is real, but manageable. Something we handle together instead of me carrying alone while pretending we had no problems. Every aspect of our life is more authentic. And while that authenticity sometimes means confronting unpleasant truths, it also means our moments of joy and connection are genuine rather than built on the foundation of my lies. Adrian told me recently that he doesn't regret how we got here, even though the 3 years of lies and the painful process of truth-telling were difficult. He said those experiences taught us both essential things about trust, honesty, and what it means to truly partner with someone through genuine hardship rather than manufactured ease. He said if he could go back and change things so that I'd been honest from the beginning, he probably would. But he also recognizes that we might not have developed the depth of communication and understanding we have now without going through that crisis. The therapist calls this post-traumatic growth, the way some couples emerge from betrayal and crisis with stronger relationships than they had before. Though she's clear that not everyone manages this transformation, and we shouldn't minimize how close we came to permanent damage. I'm grateful every day that Adrian chose to stay and work through it rather than leaving, which would have been completely justified given how thoroughly I'd betrayed his trust. That gratitude motivates me to continue choosing honesty even when it's uncomfortable, knowing that the alternative is returning to the prison of lies that nearly destroyed everything we'd built together. Looking at other couples now, I wonder how many are maintaining their own versions of protective lies, filtering reality for partners they believe can't handle the truth. I see it sometimes in how people talk about their relationships, the carefully curated versions of their lives that smooth over difficulties and present an illusion of ease. I understand the impulse so completely, that desire to protect someone you love from pain by controlling their perception of reality. But I also understand now why that protection ultimately becomes a cage. why people deserve to know the truth about their own lives even when that truth is difficult. The work of maintaining lies is crushing, isolating the liar in a false reality they have to remember and defend constantly. And the person being lied to, even if they don't consciously know it, can sense on some level that something is wrong, that the reality they're experiencing doesn't quite match the descriptions they're receiving. Adrian said he'd had moments during those 3 years where he'd felt a disconnect between what I was telling him and what his other senses were suggesting. But he'd dismissed those instincts because he'd trusted me completely. Learning to trust his own perceptions again after discovering I'd been lying had been part of his recovery, reconnecting with instincts he'd learned to doubt because they contradicted my descriptions. The story I tell about those 3 years now is complicated, acknowledging both my good intentions and the harm I caused through my dishonesty. I don't claim to be a villain who deliberately hurt someone I loved, but I also don't pretend I was simply a devoted wife protecting her vulnerable husband. The truth is more complex, that I was someone overwhelmed by circumstances who made choices that felt necessary at the time, but which ultimately served my own need for control more than Adrian's actual well-being. I've had to sit with the discomfort of knowing I caused real harm to someone I loved while having meant well, that good intentions don't excuse or erase the impact of my actions. That's been one of the hardest lessons, accepting that I can be both a loving partner who is trying her best and someone who betrayed trust in fundamental ways. Adrian says he holds both of those truths too, that he can acknowledge my love and dedication while also naming the harm my lies caused, that human beings and relationships are complex enough to contain both realities simultaneously. We've shared our story with other couples dealing with disability, speaking at support groups about the importance of honesty and authentic partnership rather than protective lies. Some people are uncomfortable with our message, preferring to believe that sheltering disabled partners from harsh realities is kindness rather than control. But others have approached us afterward to say our story resonated, that they'd been maintaining similar fictions in their relationships and realized they needed to move toward truth. One woman told me she'd been describing her husband's appearance as unchanged for years after a disfiguring accident, and our story made her realize she was preventing him from understanding how people actually reacted to him, leaving him vulnerable to social situations she couldn't control or filter. She said the conversation they had after our talk was difficult but necessary, that her husband deserved to know the truth even though it hurt. Those conversations remind me that sharing our story might help others avoid the years of lying we went through, or give them courage to move toward truth if they're already caught in similar patterns of protective dishonesty. Adrian and I are planning to write a book together about our experience, combining my perspective on why I lied and what maintaining those lies cost me, with his perspective on discovering the truth and rebuilding trust afterward. The therapist thinks it could be valuable for couples dealing with disability or other situations where one partner becomes dependent on another for information about reality. We're working with a disability rights organization to make sure we handle the subject with appropriate sensitivity, acknowledging that Adrian's experience isn't universal, and that the book needs to avoid suggesting that all disabled people need to be lied to, or that all lies in relationships are motivated by the kind of protective instinct I felt. It's important to us that the book distinguish between occasional kindness and white lies versus systematic reconstruction of reality, between protecting someone from unnecessary hurt versus taking away their agency to make informed decisions. We hope our story can help other couples navigate the complex ethics of truth-telling in relationships where power dynamics are unbalanced by disability or other factors that create dependency. The lies I told Adrian for 3 years will always be part of our story, a chapter we can't erase or pretend didn't happen. But they don't define us anymore because we've chosen to build something new from the ruins of the trust I destroyed. Every day that I choose honesty over comfortable fiction, every moment Adrian chooses to believe me despite having been thoroughly deceived, we're creating a relationship based on reality rather than illusion. It's harder than the false version I constructed, but it's real in ways that matter more than ease or comfort. We've learned that genuine partnership requires vulnerability and trust, that you can't truly love someone you're systematically lying to no matter how pure your intentions. And we've learned that truth, while sometimes painful, is ultimately the only foundation on which lasting trust and authentic connection can be built. Appreciate you watching this far. If you enjoyed it, drop a like, leave a comment, and subscribe so you won't miss the next story.